David, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Delighted to be here.
Absolutely. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself. Give us the rundown on who you are, what you do, and what you write about.
Well, I've had a diverse background. I attended university and then went on and got two more graduate degrees in business and law, and was corporate and then was in private practice. And then about 15 years or so ago, I switched over to the dark side and became a full-time academic, although I still do a lot of consulting and training and things like that, like a lot of faculty do. And part of that opportunity gave me an opportunity to learn more about doing research for writing and to get started on a more serious writing track.
Mm-hmm. And do you write about legal matters as well? Is that what you write on?
Yes, I'm fortunate. I'm published in two areas. I publish in management journals and also law journals, and I call that my academic writing. And then I do webcasts and some blogs, and also have a book out right now called Decline of America, 100 Years of Leadership Failures.
Awesome. Well, that sounds like a very timely and interesting book to read. Thinking to the start of that writing journey, specifically with your book, were there any sort of struggles you faced, maybe mindset or strategy, that prevented you from getting started or maybe from getting to that final draft easily?
It takes a lot of time to do this. And any, nonfiction writing, if you do an autobiography, it's probably pretty straightforward. But if you're doing anything else, say a biography of someone else, or in my case, writing about political and historical events, you've got a lot of research to do. And if you don't plan out what you're going to research and do that homework, your product is not going to have credibility, and it's probably not going to have much readership.
Mm-hmm. What are your best tips for doing that research well and for staying organized throughout that process?
Well, it sounds like I'm a professor, and I am a professor, but basically it starts with an outline. So I came up with a concept. I have a current book that's almost ready to go to publisher, and in the current book, I started off with a concept, and then I converted the concept into an outline, and then started quite a process of research. Now, my book in original format was 500 pages. My publisher squished it down with my help to 400 pages. But in doing that, you can't produce a book of that length that's nonfiction without doing a lot of homework. For me, as a professor, I had an opportunity because I can get college students to be interns and researchers. Now, that means spending money. These people get paid to do the work, but it's not a huge amount of money. But to produce this book, if I did every stitch of research myself, finding things, it would have taken 10 years instead of 4 years to write the book. And by then, things can change. The other thing is that two more recent developments on doing nonfiction research. A lot of stuff is on the web today, and it can disappear. So what I'm recommending to other nonfiction authors is that when you find something like a tweet or a blog post, that you make a copy of it and save it on your computer, so that if somebody comes back later and said, well, we found this hyperlink, but it doesn't go to anything, we don't think it's legitimate, we think you made it up. We're like, no, here is the copy that I made, the PDF that I made of this particular blog or tweet. And I think that's pretty important. The other thing is that even though I have researchers working with me, and I have some great people working with me, the one thing that I do is I don't use anything that I do not personally read myself. So I have researchers, but they're finders for me, and it worked in both directions. I have a very good memory, so I could write chapters and then send it to my researcher and say, I want citations at paragraph 2, paragraph 3, and make them go look up things that I knew happened but maybe it happened in May of 1966 and I remembered it as 1967. But that's where that interchange helps. But again, the bottom line is if you're saying that you're writing a nonfiction work, you need to be able to show that you really did do the research and that you have accurate things. The other part of that is it really helps to have an external editor, to have someone else. And many of us are very good writers and creative people, maybe not so good at what we call the Queen's English. So I strongly recommend that people not be shy, even if you say, gee, I'm a really great communicator. Sometimes it helps to have a third party read something for you. It doesn't have to be a professional, the editor. It's just a second set of eyes. And we found in the book that I have out now, we found several errors in the book after it was printed, which drives me crazy. And we'll fix those on the next edition of the book, but you can't be too careful.
Absolutely. Those are some fantastic tips. In terms of research, you mentioned tweets and blog posts. What types of things are you looking for in terms of research? I know for me, I was looking at published studies, expert interviews that I conducted, some anecdotes and things like that. But what are you looking for in terms of types of research?
Well, it depends on the book and the subject. So my book covered, my current book covered Wilson through Obama as presidents and focused on leadership and ethics. And so a lot of the material was historic, and you can look up historic sites. There's a whole series of books on Lyndon Johnson, for instance. We use those as reference points, things like that. But then you get to President Obama, and my book was written about 6 years ago now, just as his administration was ending. Some of that stuff's not in the history books yet. So you do need to rely on newspaper reports and things on the internet and things like that. And that's how you end up with this kind of a mixed bag of sources, historic sources, but also current. The book that I have in process now is another nonfiction book, and it's very current. So it has a lot of very current things. We have one researcher who is just making copies of the things that we've already incorporated to make sure that we have copies of different tweets and things like that. But again, a lot depends. I mean, if someone today was writing a book on World War II, they would most likely be using, historic sources, maybe go back into the New York Times and Washington Post archives, but also in terms of going into the history books themselves. And of course, there's dozens and dozens of books on that. One thing in terms of researchers, of course, being a professor, I have access to college students, but college students have a unique advantage over some of the public. We have access to university databases, and you can go to a public library and sometimes get into some databases, especially if you're in a big city. But for a lot of us, we don't have access to the man on the street cliche. We don't have access to those really first-class databases. And so if I'm just bringing somebody off the street and say, hey, I'd like you to go research this, they can use Google and other search engines, but they're not going to be able to get behind the library firewall at a major university, which is where it comes in helpful. And these databases today are phenomenal. There's just a tremendous amount of data. But again, even though there's so much on Google, it's amazing what you need to go behind the firewalls. Firewall meaning subscriptions, obviously, to get that information.
Mm-hmm. I know my university's library system was so critical for me when I was researching and writing my book, having access to all those published studies and things like that. So that's really good information to hear. David, this has been amazing. Do you have any other tips you'd share for first-time nonfiction authors that are approaching this writing process for obviously the first time?
Read what's out there on your subject. You don't want to write a book and find out that there's 40 of them out there, because if you have to have a different spin. A lot of people sometimes describe my current book as on presidential history. It's not really. It's really focused on, it incorporates some historical reference points, but it's really about leadership and ethics. So it's different. And it actually goes into management and leadership. It doesn't go under history if I'm coding the book. So you need to decide where your book is going to fit into this incredible collection of things that we have out there today. And you need to have a story to tell. And sometimes people, have a very personal story, but it appeals to you at the dining room table with your family, but maybe it doesn't appeal beyond that. So having something that has broad appeal is helpful.
That's a fantastic tip as well. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. This has been really helpful.
And thank you so much for having me on. And I wish that we have an opportunity to talk some more in the future.